In the last video, I talked about the kind of choices and judgment calls that come up naturally in the course of a modern scientific investigation, which, when abused or not paid careful enough attention to, can shade into bias or misrepresenting the contents of your study. So in this video, I'm going to go all the way to the other end of the spectrum where it's not just innocent mistakes. We're talking about actual misrepresentation on purpose, scientific fraud. So what does that look like in science, and what can we do about it? So I'd like to start with an example from the hard sciences, from nuclear physics. There's examples from all over science of scientific misconduct. I like this one because it shows that this kind of stuff happens all over the place. If you've got the mistaken impression that scientific fraud is more prevalent in, say, the soft sciences, this is the case for you. So this is the story of the discovery of element 118, which is currently called organoson. It's not a naturally occurring element. You've got to synthesize it. And the original discovery claim of having synthesized it turns out to have been fraudulent. Okay, so discovering a new element in physics is a very big deal. You get to name it. You get to fill in a new spot on the periodic table. This is an enormous discovery claim. And some nuclei can only be discovered, that is discovered by creating them in the lab. So you get a particle accelerator and you smash together two smaller nuclei. Not all of the results will be stable enough to properly detect. So some of these nuclei that you can create in the lab decay so quickly that you can't even sort of get a read on them. And detecting one is what counts as the discovery claim. So having a clear, measurable signal of these nuclei is what you need to claim to have discovered them. As the nuclei get bigger, they become less and less stable. They hang around for less time, sometimes extremely small amounts of time. But there was a theoretically predicted kind of what they call island of stability. So there's a point at which they become so large that it's unlikely you'd be able to detect them. But there was a theoretical prediction that if you go just a bit larger than that, you'll find an area in which they'll be stable long enough at least to detect them and therefore to be able to make the discovery claim. So people were investigating this so-called island of stability. In 1999, a group of nuclear physicists at the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory announced that they had synthesized element 118, the biggest element synthesized so far. But attempts, and this is a huge deal in terms of nuclear physics. But when other laboratories attempted to replicate the results, they couldn't seem to do it. Nobody else could seem to produce the signal that they claimed they had found. And then, so this raised some questions, and then the original team tried to replicate their own results, and they found they couldn't do it either. Long story short, it appears, so after a bunch of sort of forensic data analysis, it appears that one member of the lab, a very well-respected, credentialed researcher, who was the one guy who really knew how the software works to go from raw data to analysis, seems to have done a little bit of editing on their raw data. So in the transfer from having the raw data from the instruments to sending it on for a statistical analysis, he seems to have edited out a few little lines which resulted in the signal being present in their analysis. So he cheated, essentially. I mean, he maintains his innocence to this day, but as far as everybody currently believes, he just falsified the data to make it look like they'd made this discovery. And the paper was retracted, and several years later, a different group seems to have actually synthesized this. They got to name it. They got credit for the discovery claim. So the fake discovery of element 118 is a prominent example of straight up scientific fraud, as far as we can tell. Okay, so that's a big case. I mean, it's a big prominent case. There are literally hundreds of less well-known cases. Sometimes it involves manipulation of the raw data. If you recall, the peer review process typically doesn't give you access to the raw data. Typically, they don't give you their lab notes or whatever. They give you the journal article which they're hoping to publish. So manipulation of the raw data is hard to detect. An easier to detect form of scientific misconduct is image manipulation. So here we've got some images. This is in a published, peer-reviewed scientific journal article. And the point of the study was to look at what frankincense does to cells, to see whether there's important harms or damages to the cells from frankincense. So we've got a bunch of rat brain cells and rat liver cells, and there's supposed to be an image of what it looks like treated with frankincense to compare to untreated. See if you can notice something funny about a pair of these images. Okay, so the funny thing is, in the top left, the frankincense treated and frankincense untreated brain cells, those are the exact same image, pixel for pixel. That's misrepresenting what's going on in their experiment, right? Those are supposed to be different petri dishes, one of them which has undergone a treatment, one of which hasn't. The chances that they would be pixel for pixel identical are so tiny as to be completely negligible. So somebody has submitted the same image for two different experimental runs, and you can just look at it and see that those are the same images. Okay, so this is a definite case of scientific misconduct. People manipulating the images that they're using to make them look more convincing or to get to some conclusion that they're after. This image I took from the Twitter feed. This is one of my favorite Twitter feeds from Dr. Elizabeth Bick. She's found literally hundreds of images with from peer-reviewed, published scientific journal articles with clear evidence of manipulation. And that, I mean, okay, so maybe if we're feeling super, super generous, we could say, oh, we just made a mistake in this one. But many of the images that Dr. Bick has identified are clear examples of Photoshop. So you see not a complete image reproduced, but elements of the image reproduced in other images that would require somebody going into an image manipulating software like Photoshop and copy and pasting things. So these are not, in general, accidents. I don't think it's at all reasonable to suppose that of the hundreds of images that she's found in various published scientific journal articles, that they're all innocent mistakes. These are misrepresentations of the facts in order to get published. So I strongly recommend it's an entertaining and depressing Twitter feed to follow, but I do recommend her work. And she's got a blog, scienceintegritydigest.com, which is also a rich source of information about scientific failures of scientific integrity ongoing. Okay. Similarly, there is a pretty serious plagiarism problem in the published scientific research. This one, Iranian paper sparked sense of deja vu, was somebody copy pasting elements of various other scientific journal articles and putting them into their own. So various scientists have been caught doing this, publishing papers kind of stitched together from other work or grant applications or other unpublished work. There's quite a bit of plagiarism going on in the scientific literature. Now, these people often get caught, but by no means always. So this is, again, trying to take, if you think about the journal publishing process as partly trying to communicate your results, but partly trying to get credit for having made a discovery, which is one of the lifebloods of a good scientific career. These people are just stealing credit for other people's ideas, a very serious form of scientific misconduct. Okay, and I mean, you can see why they do it, because if you don't get publications, you don't get to keep being a scientist. A kind of opportunistic type of journal has sprung up around this intense pressure that people are under, often called predatory journals. So a predatory journal will accept a manuscript for publication without really doing the peer review thing that we're all sort of expecting out of scientific literature. So they typically do this for a fee. So for some fee, a predatory journal will publish whatever you send them and claim that it's peer reviewed and not actually do the peer review. So you get a bunch of low quality publications, some of which from scientists who are genuinely naive about the quality of the journal they're submitting to, some of who actually know that it's a predatory journal and just want another line on their CV. So there's predatory journals, there's predatory conferences as well. So a conference which will accept basically anything for a fee. There's been, in response to these predatory journals, there's been a series of what we call hoax papers. So to draw attention to the low standards of publication of some journals, people will submit a paper so obviously terrible that any sensible person should be able to tell that it's not a serious paper and should have rejected it for publication. But they often make it, well, sometimes, if not often, make it through the peer review process, especially in these predatory journals. And then after it's been published, the author reveals themselves and say, hey guys, did you actually read this paper? Because it was nonsense. So just a couple of quick examples. So in 2016, Christoph Bartnek, who's a professor of information technology, has no knowledge of nuclear physics as far as anybody can tell, was invited to submit a paper to a conference on atomic and nuclear energy. So having little experience in this area and smelling something of a rat, he decided to write a paper on his phone So he took his iPhone and started with the word atomic physics and then just chose randomly from the autocomplete suggestions and wrote the entire paper that way. So here's a sample of the kind of thing that your iPhone will autocomplete for you if you wish to write a fraudulent scientific paper. Atomic physics and I shall not have the same problem with a separate section for a very long, long way. Nuclear weapons will not have to come out the same day after a long time of the year. He added the two sides will have the same 2 liters to take the same way to bring up to their long ways. It goes on and on like this. The whole paper is just this word salad, and they were happy to publish it for a modest fee of $1,099 US. It was accepted within 3 hours. So if this person had wanted to get another line on their CV and they had $1,000 kicking around, they could have easily gotten this thing published. Okay. Here's another fun one. So in 2005, the computer scientists, David Mazaries and Eddie Kohler, submitted this paper to the fairly impressive sounding International Journal of Advanced Computer Technology. It is titled, "Get Me Off Your Fucking Mailing List." So the entire paper was composed of that sentence repeated over and over again. So this is a clearly predatory journal who won't stop emailing these people, and they tried to get off their mailing list by submitting this paper, which is just the title repeated. They added some helpful diagrams like this one, summarizing the main idea of the paper, and this one. So this paper was accepted for publication. The reviewers rated it as excellent, and the publication asked for a modest $150 fee to get it published. Okay, so when we're thinking about the credibility cycle, one of the main things, if not the central thing, was supposed to be peer review. And what we've got in these predatory journals are a kind of deep subversion of the peer review process, where they claim to be doing it, but they're just not. So this is one of the reasons why the what we might call the impact factor of a journal has become a really important metric. The prestige of the journals that you're publishing in makes a big difference to how much sort of career juice you get out of publishing something. So there are real incentives to publish in good journals because people are aware of this problem. Prestige of a journal is pretty hard to quantify. One of the metrics that people use is what's called an impact factor. So the impact factor is a metric of how many times the average paper in that journal gets cited. So if you get your paper published in a journal like Nature or Science, these are really important central scientific publishing things, the chances that that paper will get cited by other people are very high. So the average publication in one of these big prestigious journals gets cited a lot, which means that that journal has a high impact factor. So impact factor is one of the ways that we measure the kind of prestige of the publications that you get, and it's one of the incentives to avoid these predatory journals. All of these are fairly imprecise metrics for how good the science you did is, but it's one of the ways that people try to deal with this problem. Okay. There's also a really broad category, and this is one of the things that Grinnell talks at some length about in the readings for this week, of conflicts of interest. So systematic study. So what I think you should probably imagine here is somebody funding the study that's supposed to tell whether a drug works or not is a really sort of prototypical case of a conflict of interest. So recall the choices and decisions and judgment calls that really go into every scientific study. Those have to be made all the time. But if they're made with the background knowledge that the people paying you to do the study are really hoping for one result over another, right? So the people trying to sell the drug, generally speaking, want you to come back with, yes, this drug is effective. So when you're making those choices with the knowledge that the people giving you money to do the study want one result over another, it can consciously or unconsciously shape the way that you make those choices. I think this is one case where it might not even be the case that scientists are intentionally falsifying things or intentionally p-hacking or anything like that. You just make these judgment calls with the background knowledge of who's paying your bills. So systematic studies have shown that clinical trials of drugs, when supported by a company trying to get approval for that drug, are more likely to find that it's safe and effective. So here's a quote from a systematic survey of that. Previous research has found that pharmaceutical industry-sponsored studies tend to favor the sponsor's drugs more than studies with other sources of sponsorship. This suggests that industry-sponsored studies are biased in favor of the sponsor's products. I don't think this is a terribly unexpected result, but it does show up when you do systematic studies of the results of these type of trials. It does show up as a measurable effect. Okay. So predatory journals where peer review is not done is undoubtedly fraud. Plagiarism, image manipulation, undoubtedly cases of fraud. There are probably, similar to the choices and biases, there's probably a gray area between straight up fraud and making biased choices. So what we've really got is a kind of spectrum of quality of science where maybe it's not obvious whether something is fraud or just a biased choice. Maybe it's not obvious when something is a biased choice rather than just the judgment calls that come with any modern scientific study. There's lots and lots of examples of this sort of thing. They kind of come from all over the place. So what do we do? How should we respond to this apparent problem in the scientific method? I mean, I don't know. That's the short answer is I don't know what we should do about this. I have some thoughts, but I don't know how practical they are. I'm hoping that some of you will have some thoughts. So one of the topics for the short assignment is suggestions for improving the scientific method. And ways of coping with scientific misconduct seem like a really important place where improvements could be made. I'll just mention one or two things that are being done right now to try to deal with these kind of problems. So I talked last time about pre-registration. So with the problem of, for example, p-hacking, pre-registration is a really helpful thing to do. So if you publish online, there's lots of sort of pre-registration archives where people publish online what their hypothesis is and what kind of data analysis they're looking to do. And if you sort of state that ahead of time publicly, you can't do the kind of retroactive data analysis, sifting through the data, trying to find something. that you can if you haven't pre-registered. So that's one important strategy. It's becoming more and more common. People are sort of recognizing the importance of pre-registration, although it's by no means universal at this point. Another thing that's been happening over the last, say, 10, 15 years, and especially this particular one was at least partly inspired by a case that we talked about a couple weeks ago, which is the Feeling the Future studies. So those psychology papers that made it seem like people could sense what's going on in the future. That sparked some real concerns about the scientific method in psychology. The paradigm that they're working in was called into question, and large attempts to reproduce a bunch of results were one of the responses. And I think it's a really excellent response. So the Reproducibility Project took 100 of the highly cited, very visible, very sort of central studies from psychology, from high impact journals by reputable research teams. And they just tried to replicate each of those studies exactly. So typically journals don't want to publish just exact replications. They want a novel result. This one, they secured a few $1 million in funding to just do exact replications. And the results were a bit disappointing, to be honest. So they say the replication effects were half of the magnitude of original effects. So magnitude is different than statistical significance. The magnitude is how big the effect is rather than how likely it is due to chance. The magnitude of effects were on average about half the original studies. 97% of the original studies had statistically significant results, so they have p-value less than 0.05, whereas 36% of the replications had statistically significant results. So something like a third of these attempts to replicate produced the statistically significant signal that would have been necessary for them to publish in the first place, which was pretty shocking for the discipline of psychology. And this precipitated an ongoing conversation about what's sometimes called the replication crisis. And it's not just psychology. There's similar discussions happening in biology, chemistry, all over the sciences. People are worried about this question of how reproducible published results are. And I think it's tempting to think about this as a kind of failure of the scientific method, but I think that's actually backwards. Things like the Reproducibility Project show that science is actually working the way that we hope it does, which is to say, it's checking itself. And when it checks itself and finds itself wanting, it's doing the work to improve the scientific method. So this is a nice piece of evidence in my mind of the fact that the scientific method is not a finished product. It's not something that we worked out in the 1600s and have just been applying blindly to problems ever since. The scientific method is something that we continuously have to be improving, and things like the Reproducibility Project, the drive to pre-registration, other initiatives to improve scientific integrity are evidence that it's doing its job of trying to be a self-correcting, self-improving method. Okay, that's it for this week. Thanks.